You learn more about human nature from a broken expectation than from 100 promises, because promises show people who they want to be. Disappointment shows who they are when the mask no longer serves them. But there is a second lesson encoded in every disappointment that most people miss entirely, because it is less comfortable than the lesson about the other person. The second lesson is about you, specifically about why you were chasing them in the first place. Because chasing, the relentless orientation of your attention, your energy, your self-worth toward another person's willingness to show up, is never actually about the other person. It is about what you are trying to use them to avoid. This is the question almost no one asks when the disappointment finally lands. Not why did they do this, but what was I hoping their presence would solve? The answer to that question is the architecture of the life you have been building. And it is almost always a life that requires escape. Not from circumstances necessarily, from yourself, from the silence, from the specific and nameable emptiness that another person's presence was reliably keeping you from having to sit inside. That is what is actually being chased, and that is what this script is about. Chapter 1. Chasing as an avoidance strategy. The word chasing carries a connotation of pursuit, of moving towards something desirable. This framing is accurate on the surface and completely misleading underneath. Behavioral analysis of chasing patterns in relationships consistently reveals that the primary psychological function of chasing is not approach. It is avoidance. The person who texts first every time, who initiates every meeting, who monitors the other person's activity for signs of renewed interest, who reconfigures their schedule and their priorities and eventually their self-concept around the effort to secure continued access to another person. This person is not oriented primarily toward the other person. They are oriented away from something else. The chasing is sustained not by the pleasure of the pursuit, but by the intolerable quality of what would be felt in its absence. Stop the chasing, even briefly, and you feel it. The drop, the anxiety, the sudden confrontation with an internal state that the chasing had been successfully preventing. This is the correct diagnostic question. Not, do I love this person? But what do I feel when I stop chasing them? What comes up in the silence tells you what the chasing was managing. And what the chasing was managing is not a problem that the other person was ever positioned to solve. Chapter 2. The life that requires escape. There is a specific configuration of life that makes chasing structurally necessary. It is not characterized by obvious deprivation, no dramatic poverty, no overt crisis. It is characterized by a quiet absence at its center, the absence of anything that generates sufficient meaning, engagement, or identity on its own terms without requiring another person's participation to feel real. When a life has this quality, other people do not function in it as additions. They function as foundations. Their presence is what makes the life feel worth inhabiting. Their absence is what makes the emptiness underneath it visible. A person with this configuration does not experience relationships as optional enrichments of a life that already has its own structural integrity. They experience them as load-bearing, which is why the loss of one, or even the threat of losing one, does not feel like ordinary grief. It feels like collapse, not because the person was irreplaceable in any objective sense, because they were performing a structural function the life itself was not performing. And without them, the structure that was never built becomes immediately and undeniably apparent. This is the life that requires escape, and the escape route most commonly taken is another person, chased with an urgency that has nothing to do with who that person is and everything to do with the hole they are being asked to fill. Chapter 3. Why the person being chased always disappoints. There is a mechanical inevitability to the disappointment that ends almost every chasing dynamic, and understanding it removes the element of surprise, and with it, the narrative that the disappointment was a product of bad luck, bad character, or an unusual failure of judgment. The disappointment is structural. A person who is being chased occupies a specific relational position. They are holding, by their presence and continued engagement, a psychological function that belongs to the chaser's own internal architecture. This is a weight that no actual human being can carry sustainably, because no actual human being is built to be another person's primary source of internal stability. Eventually, through inconsistency, withdrawal, the natural variations of another person's attention and availability, the weight exceeds what they are providing, and the gap between what was needed and what was received becomes visible. This is the disappointment. And because what was needed was never actually about them, was never a function of their specific qualities or the specific relationship, the gap is not closable by them. They can try harder, show up more consistently, communicate more clearly. None of it addresses the structural absence underneath the need. The disappointment recurs in slightly different form, with slightly different justifications, until either the chasing ends or the chaser finds a replacement to begin the cycle with. This is not a pattern of relationships. It is a pattern of avoidance, wearing the clothing of relationships. Chapter 4. The psychology of craving. Connection versus building it. Most people experience their need for human connection as something that arrives fully formed, a craving that must be satisfied, a hunger that requires an external source of food. This model of connection, while emotionally accurate in its description of the subjective experience, is analytically incomplete in a way that produces the chasing pattern almost automatically. Connection is not only something that happens to you, it is also something that is built through the sustained investment of attention, intention, and self-disclosure in relationships that are chosen rather than pursued out of urgency. The distinction between craving connection and building it is the distinction between a passive orientation toward an outcome and an active orientation toward a process. The person who is craving is waiting, in effect, for a connection to arrive that will satisfy the absence they are experiencing. The person who is building is constructing incrementally a relational life that develops its own structure, its own history, its own resilience, not because a particular person fills a particular void, but because the cumulative investment has produced something with integrity of its own. The craving model generates chasing because it treats the other person as the source of something the self cannot produce. The building model does not generate chasing because it understands connection as something the self participates in producing, which means its absence is not a crisis requiring emergency supply, but a gap in an ongoing process that can be addressed through continued investment in the right directions. Chapter 5. What building a life actually means. The phrase build a life is used so often in self-improvement adjacent content that it has been emptied of specific meaning. For the purposes of this analysis, it requires precise definition. A life that does not need to be escaped from is not a life that is free of difficulty or loneliness or disappointment. Those are permanent features of any honest engagement with reality, and the promise of their elimination is always a lie. A life that does not need to be escaped from is one that has sufficient internal resources, engagement, meaning, identity, structure, that the absence of any particular person does not remove its load-bearing elements. This is built through specific, concrete, non-glamorous investment in 4 domains. The first is work in the deep sense, not employment, but the presence of something that claims your full capacity and returns a sense of competence and contribution that is independent of anyone's validation of it. The second is a relationship with your own interior, developed through solitude, through the practice of tolerating your own company without immediately filling the silence, through the gradual construction of a self that is familiar enough to inhabit without requiring external confirmation of its existence. The third is selective, maintained, reciprocal connection, not the urgent acquisition of new people to fill current absences, but the slow, consistent investment in the small number of relationships that have demonstrated genuine bidirectionality. The fourth is a physical and environmental context that reflects chosen values rather than accumulated defaults. None of these is dramatic. None of them are the kind of thing that feels urgent when you are in the grip of chasing. All of them, accumulated over time, produce the specific structural quality that makes chasing unnecessary. Chapter 6. The identity that lives inside the chase. Every chasing pattern produces and is sustained by a specific identity, a self-concept organized around the pursuit and its object. This identity is more pervasive than it appears because it extends beyond the relationship itself into the person's entire orientation toward their own life. While the chasing is active, the other person functions as a reference point for everything. What they think determines what you think about yourself. Their attention is the primary metric of your value. Their presence or absence sets the emotional weather for every other domain of your existence. Your plans are made in relation to their schedule. Your self-presentation is calibrated to their preferences. Your mood is governed by their last communication. This is not love in any sense that the word is meant to convey. It is a total subordination of the self to an external reference point, which produces an identity that has no stable foundation because its foundation is not internal. It is located in a person who has their own needs, their own dynamics, and no obligation to remain stationary enough to serve as your ground. When the chasing ends, either by choice or by exhaustion, or by the other person's final withdrawal, what remains is an identity that does not know how to function without the reference point it was organized around. This is the real loss, and it is considerably larger than the loss of the specific person. It is the loss of the entire self-concept that the chasing was sustaining. And building a life that does not require escape means, at its most fundamental level, building an identity that does not require another person's participation to remain coherent. Chapter 7. Why self-sufficiency is misunderstood. The concept of self-sufficiency, when introduced in this context, almost always triggers a misreading. It is interpreted as the advocacy of isolation, of a cold, closed-off independence that treats human connection as a weakness to be eliminated. This misreading serves the people who prefer that you continue chasing, because it frames the alternative as undesirable and positions your current dependency as a form of warmth rather than a form of vulnerability. Self-sufficiency, correctly understood, is not the elimination of connection. It is the recalibration of connection from a structural necessity to a genuine preference. A self-sufficient person can be deeply connected, deeply affected by loss, deeply invested in the people they have chosen. What they cannot be is structurally destabilized by those people's absence, because their stability does not live in other people's continued presence. This distinction between connection as preference and connection as oxygen is the entire distance between a person who chases and a person who does not need to. The person for whom connection is oxygen has no choice about how desperately they pursue it. The person for whom it is a preference retains the capacity to choose who, how much, under what conditions, in what form. That capacity for choice is what chasing removes, and it is what building a self-sufficient life restores. Not the capacity to be alone, the capacity to choose rather than to require. Chapter 8. The role of solitude in building what cannot be chased. Solitude is the practice that almost no chasing person will voluntarily engage in, because it is the exact condition that makes the internal absence most visible. It is also, for precisely that reason, the practice most essential to this entire process. The life that does not require escape is built substantially through extended, uncomfortable engagement with your own company. Not meditative solitude as an aesthetic, not the curated quiet of a weekend retreat, which provides just enough space to feel contemplative without providing enough space to encounter the actual contents of an unoccupied mind. The solitude that builds something is the sustained, ordinary, unstructured kind. The evenings not filled, the weekends not scheduled, the silence not managed by content or stimulation, or the continuous availability of other people's voices and images and dramas. In this kind of solitude, the internal absence that the chasing was managing becomes present and specific. You can feel its shape. You can identify with increasing precision what it is actually made of, what genuine desires and genuine fears and genuine values exist underneath the layer of other orientation that has been covering them. This is uncomfortable. The discomfort is the process. You cannot build an internal life without spending time inside. You cannot spend time inside without tolerating what you find there. And you cannot tolerate what you find there while you are chasing someone, because chasing is the most efficient available mechanism for ensuring that you never have to. Chapter 9. The people you stop attracting and the people you start. As the internal architecture stabilizes, as the chasing pattern is dismantled not through willpower, but through the building of genuine internal resources that remove its functional necessity, the relational field changes, not all at once, not dramatically, but measurably, over time, in a direction that is consistent with the internal change that has occurred. The people who were suited to a chasing dynamic, who required your urgency to remain interested, who activated precisely because your availability exceeded theirs, who sensed the load-bearing function they occupied in your life and responded to it with the variable reinforcement that keeps chasing patterns alive. These people become less compelling, not because you have decided to avoid them, because the mechanism that made them compelling no longer requires the same fuel. The specific quality of urgency that previously signaled "this person is necessary" now reads accurately as "this person is unavailable," which is a less interesting and significantly less tractable problem than it used to be. Simultaneously, a different category of person becomes noticeable, not more exciting, not more intense, but more present in a way that did not previously register because you were not looking for presence. You were looking for pursuit, and presence does not announce itself with the same urgency that unavailability does. This is one of the more observable external indicators that the internal shift has occurred. The relational field that previously seemed populated with people worth chasing now reveals a small number of people worth staying for. The ratio was never reversed. Your perception of it was. Chapter 10. The grief that legitimate transition requires nothing about this process should be presented as clean. The transition from a chasing organized life to a self-organized one involves losses that are real and should not be reframed as secretly positive. The urgency of the chasing was, among other things, a source of aliveness, a continuous emotional engagement that, however costly and ultimately empty, produced a felt sense of being in contact with something that mattered. When the chasing ends, that quality of aliveness goes with it, at least temporarily. What replaces it initially is not satisfaction. It is a flatness that most people interpret as evidence that they made the wrong choice. This flatness is the emotional corollary of what was described in the solitude chapter. The unoccupied interior, now visible, now requiring engagement rather than avoidance. Sitting inside it without immediately filling it is grief work, even when no specific person or relationship has been lost. You are grieving the function the chasing performed, the identity it sustained, the specific experience of being needed by your own urgency, because your own urgency was your most consistent companion through all of it. What emerges on the other side of this grief is quieter than what preceded it, and slower, and significantly harder to photograph for other people. It does not generate the same stories. It does not produce the same intensity. It does produce something that the chasing never once produced, a life that does not feel like it is happening to you while you are running after someone else. Chapter 11. Why most people choose the chase. Given everything described in this script, the structural inevitability of disappointment, the identity erosion the chasing produces, the emptiness at the center of the life that requires it, the obvious question is why most people continue. The answer is not ignorance. Most chasing people, at some level, already know what is being described here. They have had the insight before. Some have had it repeatedly. They know the pattern. They know it does not work. They return to it anyway, and the reason is not stupidity. It is that the alternative requires something the chasing never requires: the sustained, effortful, unglamorous construction of an interior life that does not depend on another person's participation to feel real. This is harder than chasing. It is slower than chasing. It does not produce the biochemical intensity that chasing produces. The anticipation, the relief, the catastrophe, the reunion that the cycle makes possible. It does not generate the narrative that chasing generates, which is always about another person, and therefore always more compelling to describe at a social level than the story of what you built alone in ordinary time through the accumulated and unremarkable investment of attention and intention in your own life. Most people choose the chase because the alternative is choosing themselves in the most specific and demanding sense of the phrase. Not as a declaration, not as a posture, but as an ongoing and frequently unrewarding practice of building something that no one else can build for you and no one else can take away from you once it is built. Closing. The cold accounting here is what the chasing cost, stated without the softening that would make it easier to hear. It cost you the time spent monitoring, waiting,
adjusting, forming the version of yourself most likely to generate continued access to someone whose willingness to show up was never actually reliable. It cost you the energy spent maintaining a self-concept that depended on their perception of you, which meant the self-concept was never actually yours. It was a negotiation conducted with someone who had no particular interest in the outcome. It cost you the internal life you did not build because the chasing consumed the attention that building it would have required. And it cost you, in the aggregate, a clarity about what you actually want, separate from what you wanted them to provide, that cannot be recovered from the inside of any chasing dynamic, because the chasing itself is designed to prevent you from sitting still long enough to find out. None of this is recovered by ending the chase. The time is not returned. The identity is not automatically restored. The internal life that was not built does not appear because the chasing stopped. What stops is the ongoing expenditure, which means the resources that were being consumed by the chase become available for the first time. What you do with that availability is the only thing this entire process was ever actually about. Not the person you were chasing, not the relationship that disappointed you, not the mask that finally slipped and showed you who they were when the performance became too costly to maintain. You. What you build, what you inhabit, what you become, slowly and without urgency, when you finally stop running after something that was never going to outrun the emptiness you were trying to leave behind.